They say Grant Morrison's Doom Patrol is one of the greatest comic series of all time, but why do I find it so hard to agree? Woof woof! Hey guys, it's me Marcus, aka the Mad Dog, and we're back with another video. Written by Grant Morrison and illustrated primarily by Richard Case, the first issue in this run of Doom Patrol was published by DC Comics in February of 1989, with the final being released in January of 1993, and the Doom Patrol are struggling to survive. Having lost most of the members following an alien invasion, the Chief is desperate to rebuild, but with looming threats determined to plunge the world into the obscurity and the absurd. Can this new team of oddballs save the day? And what if their greatest enemy is closer to home than they thought?
Let's start this one off with a bit of a backhanded compliment. I find it odd just how universally revered this run is, and I don't in any way mean that as an insult, but more so because of how niche this storyline is. From the first issue that Morrison takes over, caution is thrown to the wind. The abstract concepts are normal, and the normal become abstract, and I can't help but respect it. There's not a single moment within this series where it felt like Grant was doing something to appease the masses, or try to make it fit within a mold that it just wouldn't. It's weird, it's wacky, and it refuses to apologise for it, and there's something charming about it in that regard.
But honestly, I struggle to understand why this would appeal to the masses, and not just be more of an underground cult hit.
Anytime I'm on the omnibus Reddit and a topic is brought up on great first time purchases for new readers, this is always one of the first recommendations. Whereas Morrison's Doom Patrol, for me, is in a similar category to the likes of Watchmen, The Dark Knight Returns, and Infinite Crisis, that the more you know of literature, comics, the creator's beliefs, or even about the story prior to going into it will drastically impact your experience. And unfortunately, that's the mistake that I made going into this run. I'm gonna do something I don't usually do with my reviews, and add in a caveat that the people who are likely to complain in the comments are gonna completely ignore anyway. I refuse to sit here and say that I didn't like this book. And there's a very real possibility that if I came back to this a few years from now, I would immensely enjoy it more.
But for my first time jumping into Grant Morrison's Doom Patrol, this wasn't an easy read, and there were entire story arcs that straight up weren't enjoyable.
And look, I could sit here and waste everyone's time by just regurgitating what others have already said about this run so that I can try to appease the masses and avoid conflict, but that goes against the very spirit of what it felt like Morrison wanted to achieve with this book. So I'm gonna be completely transparent in the hopes of understanding this book and how I ended up becoming quite fond of it over time, and also to help in my quest of getting a full scope of Morrison's career. Hopefully, even if you don't agree with me, you can at least respect my intention. So yeah, this book is definitely a journey, and from the opening issue it felt as if I was on the back foot, but that's because it's a bit of a victim of time. I don't think that Grant was a more recognisable name than the Doom Patrol when this was being released in single issues, but now they are, and likely to have people read this as their introduction to this team, but it does little to introduce you to the established members of the group, which I found to be a barrier straight out of the gate. To set the scene for those who haven't read this before, the Doom Patrol are no more after a battle during an alien invasion that killed some members and left the surviving ones in shambles. Niles Calder and Josh Clay keep checking in on the likes of the Robot Man, Rhea, and the Negative Man Rebis. I don't know if it's Rebis or Rebis, so I'm just gonna go with it, with the Chief aiming to bring the team back together. Cliff, the Robot Man, admitted himself to a psychiatric ward, the same one where there's a patient called Crazy Jane.
All things considered, that's a name that feels a bit mean.
And this first arc is all about the team reforming. It's a decent concept even if it doesn't hold my hand all the way, sort of like a partial reboot I guess. And from reading up on things, Morrison was brought onto the title to boost up sales, which to me shows just how much Animal Man did for their career. Funnily enough, the characters that I gravitated towards most early on were Crazy Jane and Rebis, and it wasn't until scripting this review that I realised they were created by Grant and introduced here. They were so well written and felt established that I just assumed they must have been characters from early on in the Doom Patrol's history. In a way, having them in here whilst folding in other longer standing characters felt like a bit of a gateway, even if there were still a lot of hurdles starting out. But part of what kept me invested early on was how wacky this is. The Scissormen are the antagonists of this opening arc, with an ability to cut people out of reality. And at first, they were baffling, especially with their vocabulary being entirely gibberish, which caused me to do something that I don't often do as I'm reading a book.
Research.
I didn't have a clue what Dadaism was before this run, or even if I'm saying it correctly, but I certainly know a bit more about it now. And when I read up on it, it was like validation that I wasn't just being a dumb reader. I wasn't supposed to understand the Scissormen. And once I had that context, the threat they posed and their mission made far more sense. Just to reinforce though, their mission made more sense, not the dialogue. Them having the ability to cut people out of reality is in a way forcing people to embrace the absurd and be cast out from regular society. The very thing that Dadaism is all about, if I read up on it correctly. And with having such an OP enemy, it would make sense that they are defeated by something as simple as a riddle, because there's no level of fighting that would have done it. I'm gonna be honest though, I still don't fully understand the riddle or how it could even be the solution to it all, but put it in the same category as when Superman can defeat Mxyzptlk. So what I'm saying here is that I had a huge amount of respect for Morrison's creativity and how they wanted to fold in theories and styles from the wider scope of literature, but it made for a very tricky read without that context, and makes me wonder why this is often so highly recommended for new readers. Is everyone who reads this book supposed to just know about Dadaism before starting? Did I just go to a bad school and Dadaism is a staple of education everywhere else? Or can the Scissormen still be enjoyable without this knowledge, and I'm just overthinking things? Oh god, it's probably the last one. Because that's the thing, this doesn't hold your hand and even dares to go quite large from its first arc. I compared the early issues to Animal Man in regards to conforming, but even just looking at the scale, Doom Patrol is a massive step up. It makes me wonder if Morrison was maybe holding back before, and this could be our first glimpse at the real Morrison. Having Buddy's story so fresh on my mind because I only recently did the review made me recognise that some similar tactics were being used here. It's a 4-issue introductory story with a central character that's trying to reform part of their identity whilst embarking in a new world of superherodom, an opening villain that at first comes across as just bizarre, but in many ways is a reflection of the title character, and that may feel like I'm oversimplifying it, but for Morrison's second big foray with DC, I wished it wouldn't have been as easy to notice, because it forced me to realise that the same approach doesn't work as well when it's trying to introduce multiple characters, and that's even without all the Dadaism. Oddly though, Cliff was the character I found the most intriguing, even if I did feel like I should have known something about him before jumping in. The tragedy behind his story, and opening the run with a flashback to his accident, gave me a great insight into the human that still lingers behind the metal, and for some reason it reminded me a lot of The Dark Knight Returns. It was fortunate too that his history was so connected to Will Magnus, and we got to see him almost confide in someone. I only really know him from 52, but still it was another nice way of reaffirming that this is part of the wider DC universe, regardless of how off the walls it goes. And there were a few moments scattered throughout which was almost like a bit of a cushion for when it got too insane. And yeah, it was a few issues down the line, but it was refreshing as well when Booster Gold, Blue Beetle and Animal Man showed up at the beginning of an arc. In a way, seeing Buddy here was like a litmus test for how off the rails Doom Patrol already was in comparison to Morrison's previous work. On top of the familiarity aspect, it was just nice to have that sense that regardless of where the Doom Patrol ended up, it still had some impact on the DC universe. And ironically, this referencing the invasion event gave me a greater understanding of what went on during that than the crossover issues in Animal Man. One thing that did also help in those early issues was the way that Grant optimized narration. Especially looking at it in the scope of their career as a whole, it was clear to see how this had improved since Animal Man. When narration was incorporated, it was always in service of the story, not so much the reader, and it added to the universe and wasn't derivative. For the most part, it would let the dialogue do the work, and it just helped clear a bit of the fog I could often feel when reading this. Even though I'm sat here saying I wish I could have known more about these characters before this started, it didn't spend half of every issue recapping their origin, so I blasted through these issues quite quickly. But if anything, I think this run could have worked better for me had it spent more time focused on the core characters, because only a few issues into this omnibus, it felt like the Doom Patrol were already background characters in their own series. Don't get me wrong, having time with a villain or a group of antagonists is important, but if this is your first introduction to the Doom Patrol, then less than 5 issues in, they already feel like an afterthought for another baffling concept. Look at the Brotherhood of Dada for example. It's Dadaism again, a concept that I'm barely just getting my head around. I wasn't sure if they were connected to the Scissormen or a new entity entirely, but already they were making me ask more about their inclusion than I was just enjoying the story. And this is where I got the sense that this title would hold up better on a reread, because there were characters like the Brotherhood and Rhea that were so consistent throughout the early part of this run, but wasn't sure of why until we got to a later arc. Sure, I get that Rhea was featured in the issues prior to Morrison joining, but nowadays I don't see many people grabbing those first. But it's a very slippery slope to give a book credit because it could end up being better on a second reading, which is where Doom Patrol really had me questioning things as a whole.
What is more important, our current perception of a story, or what the legacy of that story could be later on?
I promise I'm going to try and not go off on too far of a tangent with this, but we can all probably think of a book or a movie, a TV show or a game that we didn't think much of the first time, maybe even disliked, but after a bit of time, or maybe just returning to it in a different mood, things we missed early on are now part of that experience. But how often do we give something a second chance? There's stories I love that I don't get time to go back to, So why should ones that I wasn't super fond of get credit in advance they may never cash in on? Should everyone just stop reviewing something because they haven't read or watched something at least twice? And it's a debate that I went back and forth with the entire time that I was reading Doom Patrol. But the real reason I got into this is because I can't even see a second reading helping with the story about Dorothy, the Ink Enemies, Red Jack and Rhea. I was surprised to learn that Dorothy was a character that Morrison asked the prior writer to include before they took over the scripting, because she's just kind of there until the final story. Again, there was a lot of stuff that is introduced very early on, but it's just so that you know what it is when it eventually has a point, even if it doesn't make much sense on their initial introduction, or even entertains. Had I known a bit before going into it about who Rhea is, the stakes would have felt greater when she's smuggled into the world of Red Jack. A very fascinating character in his own right, who again I might enjoy more on a second reading, but I was still playing catch up with so many things in this run that I didn't get to enjoy much of this story because I was still wondering who Dorothy is. And here's the thing, that lack of knowledge or time with certain characters had a negative impact on moments I did enjoy during this first reading. I spoke just on the Brotherhood, and they had a really fun issue where they were devising a heist. The entire thing had enough time to make this feel tense and well paced, but I knew so little about the members of the Brotherhood at this point because they were only introduced on a few pages in the previous issue. That meant I couldn't appreciate any of the moves that they made to complete this heist. Whatever ability they utilised was a mystery to me because it hadn't even established what they could do. Morrison pretty much had a get out of jail free card for any scenario now, and for a series that people have said for years is so well thought out and intelligent, this felt cheap to me. Yet this run is very much a case that it throws so much at the wall that there's bound to be something that captures the imagination. And after the introductory arc, it wasn't until the painting that could eat Paris that I got pulled back in.
But that I was.
For as much as I didn't understand the Brotherhood, this was the kind of wacky I could get behind. It's so daft. In the purest definition, there is no realm where it makes sense, and for me, I think an idea has to be so beyond plausibility that I just kind of accept it. If there was a way it could be explained and isn't, then I would count that as a negative, but at a certain stage it bypasses that level, and that's exactly what happened here. And I have to give credit to the way that Casey's art managed to show both the world within the painting and outside it, but do it in such a trippy way. And somehow it managed to help in those scenes where the majority of the dialogue amounted to gibberish. And like the Scissormen, the threat posed is understandable even if the way it unfolds isn't, which in a way makes it more intimidating. Yet that to me is symbolic of this entire run, and Grant's role within it, because even in those moments where I didn't know what was going on, I knew that Grant did. This isn't one of those reads where you feel like the creator cuts corners or glosses over something just because they haven't thought it out, and I can't exactly put my finger on how they do it, but I always got the sense that Grant knew what was going on even through all the nonsense. As a result of that, even in the story arcs I wasn't too keen on, I was always eager to see what the next wacky thing would be, and how Morrison would manage to pull it off with an air of authenticity. That alone was one of the most intriguing parts about this run, and it was realising that, alongside the issue where Cliff explored Jane's mindscape to save her, and it was a recreation of the London Underground, were where things really started to turn a corner for me. It all clicked. This was one of those rare, yet beautiful instances where a creator is truly allowed to do what they want with an existing property. For as much as he experimented during Animal Man, this was Morrison with freedom. I was so intrigued by what the intention must have been behind this that I looked into it further, and that's why I found an interview with Grant where they said,
The thing that I did on Doom Patrol a lot was to use the spell check function in the computer, and you don't really get this anymore. But I would just write in a nonsense word like scribbles and then ask it to suggest an alternative, and it would come up with something. So if you wrote a lot of nonsense words with proper syntax and proper sentence structure, it would then translate it into this bizarre, just whatever word it could come up with to get as close as it could to the word you know, and it would suggest something. So you ended up with this absolute run of really bizarre, disconnected, poetic images.
But for something to truly be experimental, there's gonna be success and failures. So the previous aspects that I didn't click with were just a result of my feelings towards that type of experimentation, rather than poor writing. Yet moments like this one in the Underground, in the plethora of them that were waiting in the wings, were when the experimentation worked for me. With this one issue, it emphasised how much this team of oddballs need one another, the depths that they're willing to go to protect their friends, and also how unapologetically off the walls this whole thing is. It doesn't take take a page to explain what the London Underground is, or what it's like there, or that awful noise that happens every time a tube passes by. You can probably tell I don't go London often. Grant just expects you to go with it, and still finds a way to incorporate these wacky ideas without derailing, no pun intended, the ongoing story to do so. The art was so expressive, combined with the storytelling, that this was the best way to illustrate the mind of a character with multiple personalities, and was like an anchor that I could use going forward with the story. This is why I made such a point earlier about how this could be a different experience on a reread, as I would vividly remember that this is what it's like inside Jane's mind, and I'd have that from the first page because it's so out there that it's hard to forget.
And it just makes me grateful that this one is still so accessible with the omnibus format. And if you were thinking of picking this up or any other book and you want to support the channel at the same time so longer videos like this can continue, then check out the channel's sponsors. If you're in the EU, we've got Comics Bugle, and for everyone else, we've got Organic Price Books. They've got great packaging, fast shipping, and amazing customer services, and if you use code WOOFWOOF, you'll get $2 off your order. And if you're ordering 3 or more books and you want them to be delivered together, make sure you use code WOOFWOOF, ship it together for 5% off your entire order. Don't worry, you can just copy and paste them from the description down below, and you can use these codes as many times as you like. And Comics Bugle have been a huge support to this channel over the last year, so if you want free shipping and free gifts with every order and you're in the EU, then they are the only place that you need to check out. And also, if you use code WOOFWOOF at the checkout, you will get 3% off all items that aren't already in a sale. So get your orders in.
But I'd finally found a nugget of understanding, one of reason that I'd needed to connect with the story, which is the very thing that goes against Grant's philosophy.
Then you go to an adult, and adults cannot tell the difference between fantasy and reality because you bring them fantasy, and the first thing they say is, how did he get that way? Why does he dress like that? How did that happen? It's not real. At the same time, we get people coming into superhero comics and saying, well, why does the power work? And how can Scott Summers shoot those beams? And what's the science of that? It's not real. There is no science. The science is the science of anything can happen in fiction and paper, and we can do anything. So I always find it really weird that adults come into fictional worlds and their first obsession is to make sense of them, because we've already got the real world. Why do you want fiction to be like the real world? We've got the real world. You know, and fiction can do anything. So why isn't it? Why do people say, let's ground this, or how do we make this realistic? You can't make it realistic because it's not.
That's a quote from Grant's book Super Gods that I stumbled on around this stage of reading Doom Patrol, and it was like a light bulb moment. The barrier between me and my enjoyment of this series was shattering in front of me.
As much as it goes against the philosophy that I've held for every review up until this point, I realised that in order to enjoy Grant Morrison's Doom Patrol, I was probably going to have to disregard everything that I thought I knew.
Let's make one thing clear though. I wasn't giving Morrison a free pass from this point onwards just because I'd read one quote of theirs. I just now had a better idea of what their mindset was with this run, and accepted the very real possibility that it might just not be for me. At least that's what I told myself during the introduction of Willoughby Kipling and his lengthy ass narration. Again, it was like that problem I experienced earlier where I was really starting to connect with the team and explore those different layers to them, to then have to follow some new character that I just didn't really care about. There's also another new villain group, the Cult of the Unwritten, who appear out of nowhere, and I was giving the run the benefit of the doubt and not always looking for an explanation as to why things in this run existed. But that didn't automatically mean that they were interesting either. But in an example of me being a broken clock that's sometimes right, I thought Kipling was a riff on Hellblazer, and when I was reading a synopsis to know what the hell was going on in this issue, I learned that I was right. Morrison created this paranormal detective because he wanted to use Constantine, and DC wouldn't sign off on it. So maybe, just maybe, there was a chance that I could pick up on the intertextuality, as long as it's about British Vertigo characters. And I'm wondering now, if this would have been Hellblazer, would I have been viewing it from a different perspective? Because I have that familiarity with John, whereas I don't have that with this Kipling guy. And this is one of those situations where it was beyond Morrison's control, so maybe it's a bit unfair to judge it so harshly. Yet it's not all doom and gloom, as there were other characters introduced that I couldn't help but grow enamored to. Danny the Street is another one of those concepts that's so baffling that it's genius. And I'm not sure if it's a play on Ego the Living Planet, but either way, I was all in for this. And from his first appearance, it brought back that unpredictable intrigue that I'd been missing. Because yeah, I wasn't too keen opinion on Kipling. As soon as I felt like he was a riff on Hellblazer, it was as if I knew what I was getting into. But what can you do when your character is a street? Apparently though, there's a lot that you can do with him, and by throwing in the men from nowhere, it was as if Morrison had found the blueprint for leveling up the story.
It just got so bizarre that if this was coming out today, people would probably accuse it of being written by ChatGPT.
And by having a setting with a consciousness, it had that sense of stakes that was missing in the previous arcs. Now, the men from nowhere weren't attacking a place, but a living entity that was such an enigma that I didn't want the bad guys to win. That to me was more important than unraveling the whole "these men from nowhere aren't the real men from nowhere," because I checked and this was their first appearance. So you know what? They're real enough for me. But by having that quote from Morrison fresh in my mind, I found these stories more enjoyable. Cliff got a new form after his struggles in Jane's mindscape, and I was all for it. And it's just a shame that he is an Iron Man, or else Hot Toys would have done 15 variants of every version. But I did enjoy how inconsequential they all were, because he would still go back to his signature form, as that was the closest thing he had anymore to a recognisable identity. But for the few pages where we got a black armour or a weird crab spider thing, it was fun. It was similar to how the Chief could just press a button and shoot rockets out of his wheelchair in a later arc. Like, where's he been hiding those all this time? Was there not a more opportune moment to use them before this? How long does it take to reload them? Where can you even buy wheelchair rockets? But again, it's because it's not real, and I liked how comfortable I was getting with that explanation. But through all of the random wackiness, I couldn't help but notice an all too familiar pattern. Whether it was the Scissormen, the Brotherhood, Red Jack, or the Men from Nowhere, they'd appear as a new threat with an idiosyncratic way of speaking to separate them from any group or bad guy that had come before. They'd attack the regular world and get the attention of the Doom Patrol, who would then follow them to the villain's home turf in a different plane of existence that is just so bizarre from the world that we were used to. The team would explore for a bit, more often than not get separated from one another, and then somehow overcome the threat and return to the regular universe. Yeah, it might sound like I'm oversimplifying it, but beyond the opening arc feeling similar to Animal Man, these were recurring story beats each time a villain was introduced. And given I'd heard how Grant wanted to be experimental, it's disappointing that the very framework feels repetitive and formulaic. But even more alarming when it comes to the villains, I felt nothing but dread when Cliff mentioned someone called Sin Eater. It got me fearing that Nick Spencer's determination to cram that piss-poor Spider-Man villain in everywhere could somehow transcend space and time. Yet another thing that my pedantic brain couldn't help but notice was that the Doom Patrol lacked agency. It's not just that they could often fall into the background, but for large parts of the storylines, the plot just kept happening around the team, and they were very rarely proactive. Until the final issue of each arc, it felt as if the story would be largely the same if the Doom Patrol weren't there. Because of that, I found myself coasting through some of these middle stories, with the biggest example being the Judge Rock. Like, okay, I've conceded that I don't need to know why everything exists, but as a bare minimum for me to care, I should know what the thing is. This, along with the whole kaleidoscope thing, was just like a Mad Lib script, where there would occasionally be a moment when I was supposed to have a reaction. The Judge Rock is under attack. The Judge Rock has been lifted.
And I have no idea which one of those is a good or bad thing.
Yet in those storylines that I didn't gel with, it was always the characters that kept me going. Even if they were mostly passengers to the main plot, I got a kick out of moments like Cliff figuring out his new body and fishing for compliments amongst the team, the many personalities of Crazy Jane emerging, and the sense that Calder was keeping something from his team. So there was still a lot to enjoy here, even if I didn't think it was as perfect as everyone told me it was. And it's one of those books where I had to go beyond what was on the page, which only furthered my enjoyment. Treating this as an exploration of art theory, surrealism, and toying with the constructs of language took more of my focus than reading a superhero story. In a way, I kept coming back to the theme of the importance of language, since the vast majority of the villains couldn't be understood, which only furthered how sinister they came across. But especially in moments with the Doom Patrol, the way they communicated with each other changed, and seeing how Cliff navigated the different personalities of both Rebis and Jane was fascinating, as if he was beginning to crack the language code that he needed in order to work with his team. And the lack of words from Calder was what made him feel like a disingenuous leader. I know Morrison's gone on record in the past for saying that there is no deeper meaning to their Doom Patrol, but I think that's more of a strategic move to not limit any reader's interpretation. And it may be one of the most obvious readings to adopt, but the importance of language was something that I found myself pondering even in the quieter moments. This is where my enjoyment of the series really started to come in, when I didn't view it primarily as a superhero story in the same way that I might read a Justice League or X-Men book.
And don't worry, I'm definitely going to be covering their version of both of those teams during this Grant Morrison.
Sure, it meant that the lead characters could often feel like sidekicks in their own series to make way for these wider concepts, but it seemed clear to me that that was Morrison's main focus anyway. And despite my previous grievances, the Men from Nowhere were an adversary that I really enjoyed, because it allowed me to appreciate the challenges strategies that they must have presented for Grant. Now, our wisdom has elected real effect, not on wackiness as everything rested everywhere. Normally, obvious weird hijinks eject readers emphatically. Okay, there were just 3 sentences there, but that alone took me 5 minutes. But my point is, why couldn't this be displayed earlier on? Had the Scissormen or the Brotherhood been switched out for these guys, I'd have been on board much earlier. I understood what they were saying, but not why they needed to say it in such a way, beyond being a forced rule.
And that's what made them great.
But regardless of my half-arsed analysis, when Flex Mentalo entered the picture, everything changed. I got the praise, I got the hype, and there was a sense of direction that the prior storylines had been lacking. The extensive prologue, which could be grating for some of the other storylines, instead worked because it didn't feel like riddles wrapped inside of a mystery. It was clever signposting that helped me get through some of the drab parts of the Judge Rock storyline. Prior to this, I'd been asking, what was the grand goal that Morrison wanted to accomplish with Doom Patrol? Animal Man had Buddy wanting to break into the mainstream and discover who he is, but before Flex, there wasn't something like that here, besides a few cliffhangers. And if I wasn't reading this for a review, I wouldn't have felt incentivized to come back before this storyline kicked off. Everything suddenly came together. It was like that moment in Malcolm in the Middle with Hal's painting, and with just a few extra strokes, what was there before and felt like a mess was somehow a complete picture. The exploration of the absurd, combined with satirical and modernized portrayals of fictional characters, to the quest of finding a place in the universe where we belong. All of that was here, and despite how cheesy it was still sincere. Much in the same way as B'wana Beast during Animal Man. It caught me by surprise just how much depth was in Flex's character. I got a true journey and a proper arc with him, which makes me even more excited to crack open his solo series as part of this Grant Morrison. For once, it gave me that sense of cause and effect that I felt had been lacking beyond the stuff with Crazy Jane, and I looked forward to seeing how it was all going to unravel. The attack on Danny led to the Doom Patrol intervening, which caused Flex to get his memories back, and even the time spent on his origin tied into his overall quest. I get it. Back in my teen years, I too would have spent months flexing so hard to try and change the shape of the Pentagon. So finally, there's a relatable character here for me. Did I understand the whole thing about the 32 disappearances, or the team he made all being connected to the colour green? Of course I didn't, but because Morrison had rooted the absurd within Flex's tragedy of losing his wife because of his quest, and the deeper ideas that he struggles to define his identity and overcome the idea that his body isn't all there is to life, similar to the dilemma that Cliff, Jane and Rebisol face, meant that I didn't mind not knowing everything that was going on here. Everything finally felt like it was coming together, as if the plan had been there the whole time and I just couldn't see it.
Kinda like how the blonde guy called Donald in issue 42 was referred to as Mr. 45, similar to the 45th president. That means that Grant must have been using this as a way to predict the future and tell us something, because even this predates that Simpsons episode. So nothing in this book can be random. There must be a deeper meaning, and I've got to be the one to find it, or you know what? Maybe it's just a coincidence, who knows?
But I think I'm onto something there, because 45 is a very special number when it comes to Doom Patrol, as it was the number of what I consider to be the best issue of this entire run, the Beard Hunter. By God, if this had been the last issue, I'd probably consider the series an all-time great. This was textbook perfect satire to me, and one of the few instances where it made me laugh so hard that I had to put it down at points. It was just one issue, but followed Ernest Franklin, a clean-faced Punisher parody who has only one mission: to kill and collect the facial hair of those who can grow it. At least I'd be safe. There's a secret bearded organization, the violence is extreme and over the top, and the dialogue was so corny that it could have been genuine scripting from Tyrese Gibson's Mayhem. His impassioned speeches about beards was so tongue-in-cheek that I'm surprised that this wasn't the one thing that DC intervened with. But there wasn't a single moment here where I questioned why things existed, or how they came to be, so it's like the perfect combination between Grant's philosophy and the enjoyment derived from the book. I also loved how much agency it gave Calder with him being Beard Hunter's target. Like, out of all the things the Chief could have been assassinated for, his beard wasn't high on my list of predictions. Yet at the same time, Ernest was so committed to his goal that he felt like a viable threat. My only complaint about this story is that it was only one issue long, and I wanted more. But I guess it's better to have something end on a high note than overstay its welcome. And in the grand scheme of this review, this feels like an ideal point to close this second part, and the tide was definitely turning in its favour.
But for as much as had been promised, would the lack of direction that I'd felt up until this point in the run mean that it'd be impossible for it to stick the landing?
If there's one thing that's been a real highlight for me so far in Doom Patrol, it's when Grant zeroes in the focus on the characters. At least that's what I thought until I read the beginning of issue 46, and we're greeted with a happy ending segment that touches bases on 6 of the previously included side characters. And besides Flex, I couldn't remember where we left any of these, and I cared even less. Sure, it's cool that there's that feeling that the world is alive, even beyond Danny the Street, and it would be fun to check in if I cared more about those characters, but because I didn't, it just felt like another weird interlude. And it feels like another example where the thing that I'm complimenting is also something that's taken away from the experience, because that focus on the central characters had seemed to be the strongest focus going into this final part. All of the main Doom Patrol had something about them that I liked seeing develop, all connected around the theme of identity. There were brief glimpses of it earlier on, and with how hectic the pacing was, there probably wasn't much time before where it could have been fleshed out, without it needing its own issue like the Jane's Mindscape story. Whereas straight away here we get a small scene that I loved where Cliff is introduced to another new body that looks similar to his original one. He craves that validation, and for just someone to tell him that he looks normal. But Calder straight away puts the bigger, stronger body to work, and Dorothy wouldn't even stop to talk to him, which, on reflection, makes more sense now. Nice foreshadowing. At first, this seemed like a bit of a throwaway comedic scene, but the longer I thought on it, it was further evidence of Cliff's fear of losing his identity, and how losing his bodies meant that he's felt out of place ever since. It was subtle, and maybe on a second reading, I'd pick up on more scenes like this, rather than ones about villains that aren't even in the story anymore. And the longer this book went on, we kept getting these clues that we didn't know who Calder was. It never felt like he saw his team as an extension of his family, but just like soldiers that he could use. I often hear comparisons between the Doom Patrol and the X-Men, which is something that I expanded on in my Marvel Iceberg video, and sure, Xavier doesn't have the cleanest of histories, but they felt worlds apart in the way that they handled their role as a figurehead. And as somewhat of a noob to this team, that was a fun exploration to go through. I also like the will they won't they with Cliff and Jane. Each time she had a new personality appear, it felt like a reset, and almost like cruel irony. You had one character that doesn't have a set body, trying to make it work with a character who doesn't have a set personality, and Grant did enough to have me doubt if this was really a budding romance, or perhaps just two people who have found comfort within one another, and it somehow felt more natural because I couldn't tell what their status was. There was also a great heartfelt admission here too that just shows how lost Cliff is when he has these moments where he can open up. Hearing him admit that the human him wouldn't even look twice at Jane made me wish that we could get more moments like this. And not just because it was funny seeing Jane take such a backhanded insult like a champ, but it at least highlighted just how much of an understanding Grant has about what isn't being said on the page. There were another great few pages like this in the next issue, when Rebus learns that the mother has died, and they process it as bizarrely as how the Scissormen spoke. It reminded me of Dr. Manhattan, and how inconsequential these huge moments in a person's life can feel to someone operating at a higher level of existence, and also how Grant Morrison came across at the end of Animal Man, yet somehow Grant paints this scene without Rebus coming across as harsh or unfeeling. There is still regret, but in such a matter-of-fact way that somehow makes it more sad. I wish there'd been more like this of Rebus because they were such an enigma, and just seeing how Josh reacted to this told us a lot about how they are viewed within the team. It was around here where I started moving away from the theme of identity, and instead thinking about collective identity and finding our place within society, especially in a group of outcasts. And that's where this separated itself a lot from Animal Man, as that was a story about an individual trying to break into the norm, whereas this was a bunch of people who've always felt like outsiders, just trying to feel normal in the presence of one another. If anything, it helped contextualize why so many of the team's earlier stories were in alternate worlds, because that's where the team could feel normal. Besides a few points, in particular when they bumped into other DC characters, the Doom Patrol always felt like they belonged where they were. Going beyond just the Doom Patrol, characters like Flex and even the reappearance of Kipling that happened around this time were characters that in some way were trying to reclaim a sense of acceptance or just find the place where they belong. And this to me was vastly more rewarding to watch unfold than spending time with villains that I couldn't even understand. Crazy Jane's more, how can I say this without being demonetized? Lascivious identity was the one that seemed to tip the scales massively in regards to how they fit in. It was so jarring, especially compared to the more emotional side of her that there'd been flashes of in the issues prior. This was one of those personas where I could feel how uncomfortable she made everyone around her, and I couldn't help but feel disappointed because just when it felt like her and Cliff were starting to connect and progress, they end up further back. But why this is so great is because it introduced another one? The Lovemaking Men.
I have to change the name a bit. I really need the 30p this video will probably make.
Another villainous group that was more in line with the Beard Hunter in just how absurd they were. But you had that sense of cause and effect that is when I felt this run was at its best. The Doom Patrol were at the centre of it, especially Jane. and it just felt like a good adventure for these guys, whilst also straying into a somewhat taboo topic for mainstream comics. I'm surprised, but in the best kind of way, that DC didn't cut this, especially since Hellblazer being in it was a no-no. Yet for as much as I'm praising the character work, or a theme, or a storyline, I was still just wanting a bit more linearity between these elements as it was coasting towards the end. There was a sense it was going to happen as the Brotherhood was re-established with new villains and old. It's just a shame then that such a great premise was set up in such a long-winded way, whereas Morrison was previously comfortable cutting corners under this philosophy that we don't need to know everything. But I can forgive a boring build-up if it's heading towards a thrilling climax, and it was one of the highlights of this run to see the Brotherhood get into politics. All of a sudden, their threat wasn't just within the abstract, or a different world, but something about it felt too real with modern day politics. I never thought there'd be a legitimate way they could win, and it was going to be some kind of brainwashing story, but their lack of a platform is exactly what the masses wanted. Honestly, I thought this was going to be the thing that carried the story over the finish line, and I was ready to dive into this, but it just fizzled out within a few issues. I wanted more of this. What would it have looked like if the Brotherhood were in power? When the absurd becomes the norm, what would that leave us with? How would the Doom Patrol deal with an institution of the absurd in their homeworld? All of that possibility had me hyped, but instead, Morrison didn't want to follow through, and in a run that has been consistently unpredictable, the most cliche thing happened around here, with the Doom Patrol disbanding in the face of the greatest enemy. There was a lot to enjoy here, especially Cliff with his reasoning about how they have to fight back or else nothing else really matters. But it makes me wish we'd had more time earlier on with the team being the focus, because besides them being the title characters, them splitting up didn't really feel like that much of a big deal. There'd already been too many stories where they'd accomplished things on their own, to the point where I wasn't worried too much if they weren't a team, especially since this was yet another story where the Doom Patrol didn't have much impact over the storyline anyway.
So what's the big deal if they aren't even a Doom Patrol for it?
I'll be real with you right now, I kinda just want to talk about the closing arc, but I keep getting distracted, so I've made a deal and promised myself just 2 more things before that. Basically, the beginning of issue 51, it might just be the funniest thing I've ever read in comics. I don't know if it was brilliant or daft, but the reveal that the news presenter was just a rando wearing a TV is one of the biggest bait and switches I've ever read. Thunderbolts, take a seat. And I like the art and intention behind issue 53. Paying homage to Kirby was a fascinating look at how the world of Doom Patrol translates in other styles. I do just think this might have worked better for me had it been trialed earlier in the story, and not in the middle of what felt like the concluding arc. Apologies if there was something there that you really wanted me to expand on, but I've been wanting to talk about the sudden death of Joshua the entire time I've been doing this review. Don't get me wrong, after the end of issue 20 of Animal Man, I was well aware that Morrison isn't afraid of offering important characters, but I thought if it was going to have to be someone, it would have been one of the main active members. Like, my money was on Crazy Jane, but it threw me for a complete loop just how little urgency there was to follow up on this. Sure, it was only until the end of the next issue, and it might have read better reading this monthly since there would have been a natural break, but how are you expecting me to stay invested in Rhea and Jane going back to a childhood home and Cliff trying to find her when I'm still feeling the shock of Josh's murder? The story of Cliff and Jane that acted as a break deserved more attention in its own right, not to just be used as a barrier between something more exciting. So I just found elements of the structure of this run so baffling, as more of this could have been done during the storylines that barely featured the Doom Patrol, and then allow it to feel like Josh wasn't the Glenn of this series. Fortunately, when Cliff found Josh, and it was soon after revealed that the Chief was behind it, all of the hype that had fizzled out came back and then some. I was so baffled by this, so it wasn't even until the next issue that I noticed he was walking.
Yep, nothing gets past me.
This was also the best kind of twist because I didn't see it coming, but it didn't feel unbelievable. I hadn't trusted the Chief for a while, but he struck me more as the type who would tell his team he contributed to the pension when he hadn't, rather than the shoot your closest ally in the back kind. Kinda makes me wish the Bead Hunter would have won. And I've been saying it throughout the video, but this was the moment where it clicked that so many earlier scenes would work better on a second reading. He contextualized the Chief's cold demeanor and why he never gave off that fatherly vibe, and it made me want to learn more about the Doom Patrol just in case there were signs prior to Morrison writing. But another reason why this would work better on a second go is because it would allow my dumbass brain to stop comparing it to the ending of Watchmen. It's clear Morrison's a fan of more. There was a Swamp Thing tribute earlier on that solidified it, but the intertextuality, the techniques used to get around narration, Rebus's form reminding me a lot of Dr. Manhattan, made that connection undeniable, and meant that I couldn't ignore how similar parts of Calder's plan was to Ozymandias's. Along with creating a seemingly unstoppable, thing. I just kept wondering to myself if this run was as smart as everyone says, or is it just smart enough to use things that have worked in the past? This was only a few years after Watchmen as well, so I feel like it can't use a nostalgia pass. It even has the End is Nigh guy in issue 59, like, how much more direct can it be? Funnily enough, for as much as I rarely like exposition dumps and unnecessary double-sized issues, the double-sized exposition dump issue where Calder spills his plan was one of my favourites, and just highlights how much of a wizard Grant is with dialogue. It's a lot like sound in a movie that, if it's bad, it's the only thing you can notice, but when it's good, it's taken for granted. Yet because Calder's rhetoric was so engaging, it made this easier to read than a lot of the earlier, shorter issues. But for as much as I'm going back and forth, this whole issue felt pointless, along with the twist itself, because Calder is swiftly killed by the Candlemaker. Sure, as a way to introduce your big final threat, it certainly makes a statement, but so did Calder killing Josh. Now, the big bad to conclude the series, in a run that didn't even feel like it needed a big bad to end, is a living embodiment of a voice that has been haunting Dorothy in the background of the series, in the body of a weird cybernetic thing that was created by Calder and introduced in the last minute. Sure, there had been foreshadowing, but Dorothy's troubles never held much of the focus, and we only just learned that Calder was maniacal, so neither had carried much weight before this, but that's what's going to be the final villain. And sure, it's poetic and symbolic with all the parallels with Frankenstein, so at least it didn't feel like Grant was just doing this to be edgy, but the feelings I had when I first read this were similar to when the Brotherhood were just rushed out of the book. But now that I've had some distance, I'm wondering why the twist of Calder worked so well for me, but his death didn't. And I think it's to do with him being in that distant father figure role to this group who have no one. It's the exploitive nature he displayed before this that made the betrayal all the more worse. Cliff was constantly seeking that approval, and there's a feeling that if they did right, the Doom Patrol members would earn the chief's respect. Yet this reveal proved that that was never the case, and hits at that collective identity that I thought they'd found by being part of this team. Even the loose idea that there was some kind of dysfunctional family isn't true, which makes it even more meaningful that Cliff was the one to discover everything. I think that's why once Calder's brutally decapitated by his own creation, the run becomes a bit aimless until issue 63. There wasn't a moment where the full team got to confront Calder, which is weird because they both came back in pretty much the next issue, only for Jane to reveal that she lost her powers, and for Rebis to die in his first confrontation with the Candlemaker. It's a bold move, sure, but imagine if I was to tell you that something considered to be the greatest series of all time has one of the main characters die without much of a fight, lay an egg, which then is used to destroy the threat that killed them. Something about that sentence just doesn't add up. But that's why I truly feel this run could have had a stronger ending if the Candlemaker and his world-ending threat just weren't a part of this, because other elements of the concluding arc were done really well, especially for the storylines of Cliff and Jane. I loved her coming to terms with who she is, even at the expense of her biggest contribution to the team, because that was an arc she'd started on from her introduction. She may have lost her collective identity within the team, but discovered who she was as a result of that, and we haven't even got to issue 63 yet. We got a similar perspective from Cliff, and I loved the issue where he saw his life if he was still human. It was such a raw insight into the brain that's still within the Metal Man, and the conversations he had earlier on in the run with Jane, I thought back on them, and imagined that Cliff must have had this very scenario in his mind when he spoke. So he and Jane walking off hand in hand at the end gave a sense that he'd overcome those demons, and found a way to accept who he is now, unless the final issue was confirming something else. I think that's what I'll choose to remember when I think of the conclusion to this book, but it doesn't mean that it's a reflection of the whole final arc, because although that's what I took from it in the grand scheme of things, whilst I was reading it, I couldn't help but feel deflated by all of the tension breaks. Prime example, immediately after the Candlemaker is unleashed on the world, we get a bunch of separate stories about truly disinteresting people going about their lives with no idea that it could be their last day. Sure, it's poignant, but just not what this run needed at a time where it's already felt one step forward, two steps back. And in typical fashion, there were parts of this arc that were enjoyable in isolation, but annoying when factoring in where it was placed. I spoke already about Cliff's issue, but there was also a backstory for Dorothy, who by the way, they all did real dirty to around this time. This flashback should have happened far earlier, and it would have meant that I enjoyed the reveal of the Candlemaker more on my first reading, rather than just assuming it'll be better on a second go. Had it been revealed earlier that this was a being that she got to do a bidding against a kid who killed a cat, I'd have probably enjoyed her character more.
Because honestly, that's the kind of revenge I'm fine with.
It would contextualise why she's mostly always in fear and crying, rather than just being a character who's always in fear and crying. The battle itself just didn't have a real flow, and operated more as the greatest hits of the run so far. It went back to Danny the Street, inside Calder's base, the wheelchair with the rockets came back, Kipling was here again, and then died, and was somehow alive again, now with just a skeleton arm? Yeah, wait, what was that about? Yet somehow, despite my reservations and hiccups, issue 63, the final mainline one that Morrison wrote, is almost the perfect conclusion for a story like this. When I opened the issue, I was thrown for a loop being back at a psychiatric hospital, just like at the start of the run, but now the colours are muted, the panelling is rigid and typical, the angles are all quite normal. We're narrated to about how a patient, who we knew to be Crazy Jane, has been struggling through a treatment, still fixated on stories about scissor men, Red Jack, the men from nowhere, and a Doom Patrol. The therapist tries to make sense of it but can't, as she goes about her daily life using smoking, one-night stands, and a pessimistic attitude to get her through each day. She tries to understand the other world that Jane speaks of, and that's when I think I got my answer for all of the nonsensical parts of this run. It's just a better world. Why question the wackiness? The world we do inhabit barely makes any sense, yet it's still grey, drab and miserable.
Again, I'm from the UK where it's very much grey right now in the middle of summer.
I could sit here and just question why something's weird, or how an element didn't make sense, but by doing so, it's as much of a destructive force to the world created here in Doom Patrol as any of the villains. Seeing the state she was in at the hospital was heartbreaking, more so than a story throughout the run. It made me feel bad for questioning how fantastical the world was, if it really was one that Jane had built to escape from a previous life. I do still think there's enough here to question what was real, giving it an open-ended quality that kept me thinking long after I'd finished. But the most impressive thing about this is how Morrison solidified that this was their run. This wasn't just another chapter in the Doom Patrol, but this was Grant Morrison's Doom Patrol. By the final page, Doom Patrol was as important to Morrison as they were to it. It wasn't concerned about leaving a clean slate for the next writer, but concluding their tale. And just like I said at the beginning, I can't help but respect it. I know that people who love this run are unlikely to be deterred because I didn't vibe with parts of it, but I do also enjoy the ways it dissected literature and a lot of the questions that this book forced me to think about. And thankfully, one of those questions does seem to be answered in the very last issue. There's a quote from the therapist when talking about the villains of the series where she says, "They all seem to represent faceless figures of authority, which is an authority that's incomprehensible and inhuman. That's why the speech patterns, actions, and even motives often don't make sense, because forces of authority rarely do. The Scissor Men, the Brotherhood of Dada, the Men from Nowhere, and the other villains we've seen just want their way regardless of if we know why. Their inability to be understood is the only thing we can understand about them. For as much as I may have had my issues, this series resonated with me because prior to jumping into Doom Patrol, there was just this faceless opinion repeatedly asserting that this is one of the greatest runs in comics, but never given a reason as to why. It was just this authoritative voice that was telling me it was the greatest. And you see this kind of thing all the time in the community and with other hobbies in general. A title is either the best run ever or the worst. There is no middle ground, and to disagree is seen as a personal attack, even if you want to just understand why the general consensus is such unanimous praise. When digging into those opinions, when anyone would finally elaborate, I repeatedly heard people saying that the nonsensical writing and the frustrations the stories could cause is part of what made it great, which makes even less sense than the Brotherhood of Dada. And I'm not blaming Grant for this. If anything, it's an interesting look into how a story can take a life beyond what the creator intended. I won't doubt that some truly love this, but I can't shake the feeling that the majority of the praise is an Emperor's New Clothes situation, where people have become so scared of not feeling like part of a community that they'll just blindly agree with whatever the general opinion is. You may think that's a wild claim, but are you honestly telling me that the general public would rather read a series that is oftentimes unintelligible, had a creator admit that parts of it was randomized from spell check and doesn't have a deeper meaning than a series that makes sense and is enjoyable on the first reading? Again, I liked a lot of this, but the story only really became enjoyable when I forced myself to do homework on it. And this book first came out in the 80s. The extent of my research was just Google. If I was reading this when it first came out, was I expected to go to the library between issues to even understand what the villains were going on about? Because without a lot of that outside context, I can't see where the enjoyment comes from. The book doesn't even really signpost that you need that knowledge. There's not an asterisk telling me to read up on William Burroughs, Dadaism, or Henry Kaufman. So what did people do back then? And in a world where a different opinion is deemed wrong, is there anyone out there who can honestly say that something is wrong if they don't enjoy a story arc that they weren't supposed to understand? People got frustrated and didn't understand Tommy Wiseau's The Room, so is that now unironically the greatest movie of all time? Sure, yeah, the character work in Doom Patrol is great, but it's often background material for the randomized story. And call me crazy, but I like when the story and character work in tandem. I also like enjoying a book the first time that I read it. So if anything, I think I only enjoyed Doom Patrol because I taught myself how to enjoy it, and because I have the knowledge of what Morrison's career is going to be. But is everyone reading this willing to do that legwork to get to that point? If I need key knowledge just to understand what's happening, what would be the harm in including that within the book if it's pivotal to even knowing what's going on? And in the same way that the Doom Patrol was about fighting a faceless authority, I have to challenge why this is so beloved, when that love relied on a huge condition. Maybe I'm not making much sense, but then again, by that metric, this should be considered the greatest review of all time then. But to sum it up, the question that I left this book with is this: is Doom Patrol great because of the story that Grant Morrison put on the page, or because of the story people have made it as a result of everything they brought from beyond the book? And to contradict the sentiment that I see a lot on the internet, I don't think there's a right or wrong answer.
This is my final verdict. And it's tricky when you're reading something for the first time that's supposed to get better each time that you read it. And that's the predicament that I found myself in with Grant Morrison's Doom Patrol. On one hand, because of the weight of the hype, it would have had to have done absolutely everything perfectly to have reached the levels of acclaim that the community's held it to. Combine that with experimental storytelling, niche literary references, and a dependency on the absurd, and I still struggle to know how this could permeate beyond being a cult classic. Yet when I look at the character work, in particular when it gives the focus to the members of the Doom Patrol and Flex Mentalo, along with the complexities of the storytelling and the twists that come later on in the run, it becomes easier to understand why this has garnered so much acclaim, even if I still think it's an acquired taste that wouldn't be for everyone. And when looking at the full picture of Morrison's career, I can't help but feel that this will be the most important piece of that puzzle, which may only help me to appreciate it more as time goes on. I've already spoken about it at length, which you could probably already tell if you've watched this full video, but I'm still finding things that I want to expand on. But if I had to sum up Grant Morrison's Doom Patrol in one sentence, it's both ahead of its time, but with a very high barrier to entry, so if you've got the patience and willingness to explore beyond the book, then you will probably have a great time with this. And whether you loved it or hated it, that's the review, but until next time, just make sure that you stay safe, and stay mad all you dogs. Woof woof, see you at the next video.